Let's get into timing here. How close are we to the, as you say, snowflake moment?
Well, if you want to be scientific about it, Greg, and stick to the science, which is what I like to do, the answer is we don't know. In other words, it could be tomorrow. It could be 3 years from now. I don't think it's 10 years away. I don't even think it's 5 years away. But it's not necessarily tomorrow, but it could be. In other words, maybe a snowflake will start an avalanche, but maybe it'll just pile up more snow. And it could pile up and pile up and pile up. Now, what's happening is that, everyone's waiting for some blunder down the road, and the point I try to make is the blunders have already been made. The blunders are already built into the system. You can see this collapse coming a mile away, but what we can say is that the longer it goes on and the larger the system gets, and when I say the system, I'm talking about concentration of bank assets, the size of derivatives books, the interconnectedness, what's called the density function of the financial system as a whole. The greater that gets, the larger the collapse when it happens. So we cannot, using the science, we cannot say very much about the timing, but we can say a lot about the magnitude. And what that reveals is that this will be the greatest financial collapse in history. So I feel quite sure about that, but we can't be sure about the timing. But what I say to investors is, why wait? What are you waiting for? People think that, I can call them up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and say, tomorrow's the day, sell your stocks, buy some gold. It's all good. I can't do that. I don't know what day it's going to be. And by the way, if we get to that point, even if you knew it was going to be tomorrow, it would probably be too late to act. So the time to act is now. By the way, on top of everything else, on top of the threats you mentioned, Greg, from Ebola and the Islamic State and the normal currency wars and the normal depression that the world is in, there's financial warfare going on right now. We put sanctions on Russia. You think Russia is just going to sit there and take it? Russia is responding asymmetrically through cyber warfare. At the end of July, Bloomberg Business Week ran a cover story called the NASDAQ hack that revealed that the Department of Homeland Security and FBI found a Russian attack virus embedded in the NASDAQ stock market in 2010. Now, I was just sitting there waiting to be activated. This wasn't some criminal gang or people trying to steal your credit card or identity theft. This was the Russian state preparing to take down our markets. They're entirely capable of that if we ratchet up the pressure too far. And I don't think we will, because I think we're probably smart enough to understand what I'm describing. But if we ratchet up the pressure too much, Putin will just close the New York Stock Exchange. So investors will wake up, you'll have your 401ks, your stock portfolio, your mutual funds. All of your so-called stocks will become private equity because you'll still own them. You just won't be able to trade them. See, the problem in a boom, in a bubble, which we're in now, people think everything's money. You think your stocks are money because you can sell them and get the cash in your account in a couple of days. You think your money market funds are money because you can call your broker and get the cash in your bank account tomorrow. You think your house is money because you can take a second mortgage or sell the house. So what you find out in the panic is that all those things are not money. You're locked in, locked down, can't get them. The only thing that's money is money. That would be cash if you happen to have it, or gold or silver if you have it in physical form, not paper gold. So people don't really understand what money is until everyone wants their money back, and then you find out that only a small number of things are actually money. So if Putin shuts down the stock exchange, let's just look at August 22nd, 2013. The NASDAQ stock market was closed for half a day. That was a year and a half ago, almost a year and a half ago. We've never received a credible explanation as to what happened there. It suggests to me that it probably was some kind of military attack, and they don't want us to know that because if people understood that risk, they'd pull their money out of the stock markets. That's why they're not telling us.
Well, I got to talk to you when you say take action. And I find it, I've told people the story about it. I say, Jim Rickards told me something amazing, and his friends, and your friends are and people you are with, and I'm not trying to, have this two-tier system or whatever, but your friends are different than most people's friends. You consult for governments. You know very wealthy people. You consult wealthy people, and that's not a bad thing. But for them to say to you, hey, Jim, tell me the day before this happens, I'm like, wow, that's a stunning lack of grasp of how serious the situation is to me. And when you say take action, you're talking about going out and buying gold and silver and having some cash. Is that what you're talking about?
Of course. Not all of it, not 100% of your portfolio. And that's not well understood. I say maybe have 10% of your portfolio in gold, have it in physical gold. And then the price of gold goes down, and, these people on Twitter or whatever, they're like, oh, you're an idiot because you recommended gold and gold went down. Well, look, I recommend 10%. If you have 10% of your portfolio in gold and gold goes down 20%, that's only a 2% decline in your portfolio. Meanwhile, you should the other 90%, in my own portfolio, I have an art fund, I have alternative investments, I have some cash, I have land, I have other things that are doing just fine. And so that kind of real diversification is the key. A lot of people, they'll go out and buy 100 stocks in 10 different sectors, and they'll tell you they're diversified. They're not diversified. They may have 100 stocks, but they're in one asset class, which is stocks. And the stocks are commoditized these days, and they'll all go down at once in a panic, or if they shut down the stock exchange, they all get frozen at once. So that's not diversification. You can have some stocks, some land, some art, some silver, some gold, some cash, have all of these things, and if one's going down, the other one's going up. But when the time comes, when the day comes, when everything else is going down and gold's going up, 2, 3, 4, 500%, that's when you're going to be happy to have the 10% gold. So that's the way to put it in perspective. But I absolutely do recommend that for a part of the portfolio, and I want to emphasize part, because the thing I like about physical gold, Greg, a couple things. Number one, it's not digital. You can't wipe it out with a few keystrokes. It doesn't get wiped out in the cyber war. Number two, it's not something where you're depending on anyone else. In a financial panic, it'd be very easy for the government to reprogram all the ATMs to limit you to $300 a day. And they'll say, look, $300 a day is enough for, gas and groceries. So that's all we're going to let you have. We're not stealing your money. We're just freezing it. And you can go to the ATM, but you can only get $300 every 24 hours. Are people ready for that? Probably not. So you probably want to stack, whatever, $5,000-$10,000 in cash, so you're not subject to that kind of lockdown by the government. By the way, if you notice, since 2008, the 5 largest banks in the United States have a higher concentration of all the banking assets. So everything that was too big to fail in 2008 is bigger today. Now, obviously, that entails a lot of risk. If you understand, again, going back to the earlier part of the discussion about complexity theory, that increases the risk. So why would the government do that? Well, the answer is it's kind of like herding pigs into a pen before you slaughter them. It's easier to get them all into one pen. By herding the savings of the United States into a very small number of banks, it makes it easier to lock down those banks so people can't get their money. So whereas if there were hundreds of large banks, it'd be very hard to chase around 100 banks and people would be, running from bank to bank and all that. But if you have a very small number of super ultra large banks, it makes it easier to lock down the system. So that's the kind of thing that's going on. I think most people are oblivious to it, but we've seen it around the world. We've seen it in history. A lot of people don't know that. And if you tell people that there was a time not that long ago when the Secretary of the Treasury called the New York Stock Exchange and closed the New York Stock Exchange for 5 months. Are you aware of that? I think most people are aware of that.
I did not know that.
Well,
was that back in the early 1900s?
It did. It happened on July 29, 1914. Secretary McAdoo, Secretary of the Treasury, called the New York Stock Exchange. They closed it down, did not reopen until December. Now, you can say it's 100 years ago. It would never happen today, but I say 100 years, it's not that long ago, and it could happen tomorrow. So this is the kind of thing people are not ready for.
Do you think that, do you think we're getting closer on the arc? I mean, with this gyration, I'll just say that I'm looking at the stock market, and I'm not a stock picker, I'm not a stock investor, but, down 275, up 275, down 300. I mean, wow. I mean, it just looks like it's whipsawing in a bizarre way. What do you make of that? Does that mean anything to you? Does that mean we're getting closer to the snowflake moment?
Sure. I mean, I've talked about it for years, Greg. I call it NDV, or non-directional volatility. And the reason for it is everybody wants to be on one side of the debate or the other. Everyone falls into these false dichotomies and binary logic. People worry about inflation. The Fed printed $4 trillion. We're going to get inflation. Buy some gold, get ready, here it comes. And then, guys like Paul Krugman laugh at that and say, look at the price indices. There's no inflation anywhere to be found. Actually, you ought to worry about deflation. Christine Lagarde and Janet Yellen have talked about deflation. Some of the Federal Reserve Bank presidents have talked about it. And one of the reasons I don't think they're going to raise rates next year, in fact, I'm quite sure they're not, we might even go to QE4, is because the Fed's more worried about deflation. Mario Draghi in Europe has spoken about deflation as one of the reasons he's prepared to act. So you've got the inflation crowd, you've got the deflation crowd. What I try to explain to people is you have to take these two opposite ideas and process them at the same time. F. Scott Fitzgerald said the sign of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And I think that's right. You've got to have both ideas in your head at the same time. By the way, the guy who understands this is Warren Buffett. Look at what Warren Buffett's actually doing. Forget about what he says on TV. Look at what he's actually doing. He went out over the last several years and bought the hardest of the hard assets. He bought a railroad, which is all hard assets. A railroad makes money moving hard assets. He bought Suncor, which is oil and natural gas. He just bought a large network of auto assets. Auto is a hard asset. It's a real thing you drive around. Okay, so that's getting ready for the inflation. Those assets will do very well in inflation. But he's also sitting on $55 billion of cash, the most cash that Berkshire Hathaway has ever had, about 20% of their total portfolio. Cash is a deflation hedge. So what Warren Buffett's saying, okay, and I agree with him. He's right. He says, I'm not smart enough to know if it's going to be inflation or deflation. The smart money knows that it could be either one. So you need to prepare for both. So have your hard asset portfolio. Most of us can't afford to buy a railroad or a Picasso, but we can afford some gold or silver. That'll serve just as well. But also have some cash. That's your deflation hedge. But people can't process this. They want to be cheerleaders. They want to get their pom-poms out. They want to be over here or over here. They want to be on one side or the other. The ability to process both vectors and be prepared for both, which is what you have to be, is very, very difficult. But that's what investors need to do.